what's a better story, Bloodline or nWo?
Well, I mean, okay, I will say this, and it's just tough to beat the peak of anything that happened in the 90s, because that was, I mean, wrestling was just so mainstream then. The Rock, Stone Cold, the nWo, like it was everywhere, right? So the Bloodline, obviously at its peak, and I don't even know if it's necessarily had it. It's been relatively. I mean, there are dips when Roman's not around, but it's still relatively. I mean, it's up there, but it's a pretty just steady progression. So is the peak of the Bloodline better than the peak of the nWo? No. Like when Hogan dropped the leg, like that's still just an iconic moment in wrestling history. What makes the Bloodline the greatest story ever told in professional wrestling is that they still have us hooked 4 years later. Like they have found twists and turns in this whole thing that have just had us hooked. At this point in the nWo, like 90% of WCW is either in the Wolfpack or Hollywood, and they had all these different. No, it was just so damn convoluted, it just didn't make any sense anymore. So, Bloodline to me is running circles around nWo, even though the height and the peak of the nWo might have been a little bit higher.
That is all correct. And because Eric Bischoff said it, I couldn't care less. Go ahead.
When he says things like this, it takes the criticisms he has of AEW. Like when you say things like this, it just shows that you are inherently biased. And I understand, like the nWo is your baby, and it's what got you 83 weeks in the podcast, and literally all the success that you have is based off of the nWo, because that's the hottest thing you had and the hottest thing that you created in WCW. But when you bogart it the way you do, and you just coddle it the way you do, now the criticisms you have of AEW, oh, they're just too stuck in their ways. They're never going to change. This thing's always going to suck. Like, it has no credence to it, because it's obvious that you actually have no ability to look at anything unbiasedly.
Hey, man, for Jim Cornette and Eric Bischoff and many others, there's money in it. Yeah. Just shit on AEW every time you take the microphone, because there's money in it. And people like Robitaille Sheep are like, yeah, AEW sucks. They'll never succeed. That's funny. They have a TV deal that's very lucrative. Looks like they're doing just fine. And this is the old school wrestling people from the 80s and 90s that don't understand television ratings and how it doesn't matter anymore. They are paying AEW to put it on Warner Media. Right. Yeah, mm-hmm. and of course, yeah, Brian, they'll never understand that. But when it comes to Eric Bischoff, so there's a lot. I have a lot of problems with Eric, but one of the major problems is that you cannot be an analyst for wrestling and just shut the door on one company and say, I give up. They'll never be right. How could you say that when you failed in several companies?
Right.
I mean, you were bankrupt. You helped put WCW in bankruptcy because you didn't have anything besides Goldberg and nWo. You were pretty much a one-trick pony. You went to TNA and said, I had nothing to do with TNA. But then you had a part in the creative, and you try to flush that company too, because you brought in the old same issues from WCW you brought to TNA and almost killed them too. So he's got no credence with me, man. I appreciate what he did in the business for his 83 weeks where he beat Vince and how exciting that was for Nitro. But it came to an end quickly. 83 weeks, that's not a lifetime. It's right. Just not. And so when his opinion about the nWo, can I just tell you, if Eric Bischoff had the pencil in WWE and had to write the story of the Bloodline, it would be dead on the vine in a year.
Yeah.
Because he'll talk about Sarza and story and all that kind of stuff. Hey, man, what was your story for the nWo? What was your story for Goldberg? What was your story for WCW for them to come back against the nWo? Right?
Yeah.
So he can't tell me about his storytelling when he would always blame Ric Flair, Kevin Sullivan, blame Terry Taylor, blame like anybody else in WCW except himself. Because when the matches happened, Brian, you know where he was? He was in a room like this with a monitor watching like a fan. He wasn't a gorilla. He wasn't a gorilla. He was always, so he can't tell me about story when he couldn't write one himself on a regular basis.
That's the funny part, though, is when you put these two next to each other, to your point, Gabe, yes, the peak of Hogan dropping the leg, nothing's going to top that. But there's only few, big moments that then came after that. Like we talk about all the time, they wasted the Sting moment. The Goldberg title win was wasted on a Nitro. Like the Bloodline, there's so many tentacles and so many stars that are being made out of this, where Heyman is what he is, where Sammy gets that Montreal pop, where you have the whole Cody verse right now, which is all tied back to the Bloodline, the Rollins and Punk stuff, which is tied back to the Bloodline. Like, they all come back to Roman, and that's all a credit to the Bloodline right now.
Well, and you want to talk about the new stars. I mean, Solo's looking great.
Yes.
Jacob Fatu is a madman that just is oozing. Like, you're just dreaming about the matchups in the future with him and all the money that you can make, and him becoming a star. Jey Uso becoming main event. Jey Uso. I know Browitz doesn't like him, but for the rest of us, we're out there yeeting along and enjoying the work that he's put in outside of the Bloodline. In his Intercontinental Championship run and everything he's done on Monday Night Raw, and now he's back with the Bloodline.
Well, I'd even say, like, I know he got hurt, but that little extra bump of Bronson being involved in that match Saturday, like, that was a little thing that, we didn't see happening with the NWO. Like, Horace Hogan isn't getting to the Bronson Reed levels and things like that. Like, we are getting stars just being around the Bloodline.